Encountering bosses in Metroid games is like opening a horrifying box of chocolates. You never quite know what you're gonna get. From dangerous ancient machinery to mutated carnivorous plants to explosively failed experiments and so much more, it's always so interesting to brush up on Metroid lore, even if you haven't played the games. For the first of many boss lore videos covering the Metroid franchise on the channel, I chose to cover Metroid Prime as it is my favorite Metroid title, and you know, maybe talking about it will woo Nintendo into making Metroid Prime 4 a thing. Because at this point, I'm beginning to think we all just hallucinated the teaser trailer into existence over 6 years ago. Anyway, the last thing I'll mention is the criteria I used to consider an enemy a boss for the purposes of this video, which would be rather simple. If it's not an obvious boss, you know, that has its own theme and health bar and whatnot, then I consider a powerful enemy that unlocks upgrades for Samus upon its defeat to be a boss. Make sense? Cool. So without further ado, sit back, relax, and enjoy this deep dive into the stories and lore behind each of the bosses of Metroid Prime. Oh yeah, and spoiler alert, obviously. In order to more efficiently cover the lore of these bosses, we're going to talk about them in groups. That is to say, we're going to first group the bosses together based on certain similarities and knock them out group by group. The first group we're going to cover would be the easiest, bosses that are native species to the planet Tallon IV, which is the planet the game takes place on. This would include the giant armored beetle known as the Plated Beetle, the apex predator of the frozen Phendrana drifts known as the She-Goth, and the mutated flower known as Flagra, although there's something unique about that last one which we will get to later on. The Plated Beetle is by far the easiest boss to understand not only in this game but probably in the entirety of Metroid lore. It's just a big predatory beetle with chitins so dense and strong that it acts as armor that renders it literally invulnerable to any attacks from the front, hence the name Plated Beetle. The first of these large bugs that Samus encounters guards the Morph Ball. Its design is very reminiscent of the rhinoceros beetle species from this other universe that I like to call real life. It really is just a big beetle though, no mutations or any other influences to be found, and we can even see the smaller, younger beetle variants throughout the planet as well, many of which are encountered by Samus throughout her time on the planet. The She-Goth, despite being a completely different kind of animal, shares a very similar explanation. It's a large, predatory species that's native to the blisteringly cold biome on Tallon IV known as Phendrana Drifts. And also similarly to the Plated Beetle, we can see baby She-Goths alongside the significantly larger and significantly angrier adult She-Goth, the first of which is the biggest and scariest of them all and acts as the boss guarding the wave beam upgrade for Samus's power suit. Interestingly, the jagged crystal-like growths on the She-Goth's back have a unique property that attracts energy, such as Samus's beam weapons. In fact, any beam that Samus fires at the She-Goth will instead home to these invulnerable crystals and deal no damage to the She-Goth, with the exception of the plasma beam, which does not really care about crystals. The last boss in this section, as mentioned previously, is the living killer plant known as Flagra. But unlike the previous two bosses, Flagra isn't natural. It's a heavily mutated UV ray-loving plant that has grown well beyond the limits of your average sunflower. But I know what you're thinking. What caused it to mutate? And what a lovely question that is. So allow me to briefly introduce and explain what caused this mutation, as well as all of the other bosses on this list, and all of the events of the entire Metroid Prime series of games, including the creation of the titular boss known as the Metroid Prime, a little planetary threat level substance known as Phazon. Phazon, in a nutshell, is a highly radioactive substance that hails from a sentient planet far across the galaxies known as Phase, or Phase if you want to get fancy with it. I'll go into more detail regarding the details behind its true purpose in my eventual video covering the bosses of Metroid Prime 3, since that is the game that revealed lots of the secrets of Phazon to us. It's almost like you should be subscribed if you want to be here when that video drops. But anyway, for the purposes of this video, just know for the time being that Phazon was spread throughout the universe from Phase by way of giant, living, wormhole warping meteorites known as the Leviathans that would target and crash into other planets, such as Tallon IV, and infect that planet with the deadly goop, assumedly to turn the other planets into other phases. The Chozo of Tallon IV, who were living on the planet when it was struck by its Leviathan, bore witness to the rampant spread and corruption of life itself by Phazon, and thus even referred to the substance as the Great Poison in their prophecies. But back to Flagra. Even though it's pretty easily understood that it's now a giant Phazon mutated nightmare plant, there's still much to be deduced regarding its original purpose. Its location being within the sun chamber of the Chozo ruins implies a lot, especially when you also notice that there's plenty of water located directly underneath the plant, aka surrounding its roots, and there are 4 giant solar panels that reflect the sun's beams built into the room, each of which can be tilted to control the amount of sun the plant receives. It's very likely due to these features, which were built by the Chozo, that this chamber was always meant to house plant life, and perhaps this plant was quite literally just a sunflower of some kind that the Chozo had planted here and were nurturing within the sun chamber, possibly to study, which they like to do, or maybe just because it was pretty. After Phazon was introduced to the planet and spread through its earth, the Flagra was eventually tainted and caused to mutate wildly, poisoning the water inside the sun chamber and throughout the Chozo ruins. It's also ironic to note that its massive mutated size is the very thing that causes it to be defeated by Samus. Due to its hugeness, it requires constant, direct, concentrated sunlight in order to remain mobile. Whenever Samus tilts the solar panels away from the Nightmare Plant, it literally falls helplessly to the ground. The Flagra drops the Variasuit when defeated. With the mostly natural Tallon IV Bosses out of the way, let us now move on to the next category, the bosses created by the Chozo, of which there are only two non-organic bosses. The first boss is a mechanical construct known as the Hive Mecha, also located within the Chozo ruins. This machine was specifically designed by the Chozo to serve as a home for organic units, in this case the dangerous Ram War Wasps, which it releases periodically in order to attack its enemy. Natively though, it has no way to attack. It's also completely invulnerable to any attack from any weapon, except for the power beam and missiles, which is a detail that is interesting enough to assume it was meant to be intentional. It's never explicitly stated as to why it was created, but since it clearly conceals the missile launcher upgrade for Samus's power suit upon activating its attack, it can be deduced that the Chozo meant for this construct to protect their weapon technology from those who do not fire power beams, those who are not the chosen one that wears their power suit, Samus Aran. Now, Samus did begin this game with all of her upgraded equipment, including the missile launcher, and only lost it all after an explosion on the space pirate frigate Orpheon knocked her suit into a malfunction, after which she landed on Tallon IV. So my thought process, that you're more than welcome to disagree with, is that Chozo prophecies must have not only told them that their chosen one would eventually visit the planet, which we know their prophecies did state, but also that she would need their help. Hence why they had to create other copies of her suit's upgrades and scatter them across the planet. Hence the missile launcher that was placed under the Hive Mecha's defense. The second Chozo boss in the game is the Incinerator Drone, which even shares the same battle theme as the Hive Mecha boss, proving the Chozo connection. The purpose of why the Incinerator Drone was built, however, is a bit easier to understand than the Hive Mecha. Scanning the boss gives us the information, blatantly, that it was a Chozo machine created to dispose of waste by incineration, which is, you know, probably totally healthy for the environment. They also gave it the ability to defend itself if necessary, however, so this leads me to believe that the Chozo always meant for it to be able to kind of sort of serve as a, you know, death by fire machine in the case that they needed to cause some enemies to experience, you know, death by fire. There are also wasps called barbed war wasps that live above this machine, although they don't literally live inside it like they did with the Hive Mecha. It is unknown why the drone attacks Samus, but because of all the similarities to the Hive Mecha, both in design and location, I can only assume that this may have also been the design of the Chozo, a construct that serves to protect the morph ball bombs that Samus needs from anyone who isn't Samus. It is of course entirely possible that both of these bosses are simply malfunctioning Chozo robots with completely unknown purposes, and that the upgrades they just so happen to drop for the power suit are not to be considered canonical, but I digress. Moving on, let's tackle the next and much larger group of bosses, those created by the dreaded space pirates, which in case you didn't know are the intergalactic group of alien beings that serve as the central antagonistic forces across the entire Metroid franchise. In fact, they're actually the ones responsible for the outbreak of Metroids across the entire franchise, including the planet Tallon IV. Notable members include the Mother Brain and her high-ranking leaders Kraid and Ridley, the former of which is a huge dude and the latter of which is the sworn nemesis of Samus Aran. And don't worry, I'll be covering all of these bosses in due time. But back to the bosses of Metroid Prime. In the Prime series of games, the space pirates have discovered Phazon due to its presence on Tallon IV and have decided to try to research the substance in order to make bioweapons out of it for the purposes of space conquest, which is the exact same thing they tried to do with the Metroids. The very first boss in the game, the Parasite Queen, is a direct result of their experiments with the planetary poison. The space pirates selected a durable, parasitic species of parasitic fauna from Tallon IV known as parasites for genetic modification via Phazon experimentation, and thus created at least 3 of the heavily mutated and downright horrifying Parasite Queen variant aboard the Orpheon, one of which has freed itself and encounters Samus directly in the ship's reactor room, which results in it fighting against Samus and getting knocked down into said reactor upon Samus shooting it enough and causing causing the ship itself to blow up. Both of the other parasite queens were killed by space pirates themselves before the ship self-destructed. As Samus's logbook entry states, the existence of the genetically enhanced parasite queen proves that the space pirates had achieved considerable results with their phase-on experimentation. And boy was it right about that, because they did not stop with the parasite queens. This led the space pirates to begin to think outside the box in new ways to apply phase-on experimentation. Because of this, they decided to create individual projects, each of which would focus on applying phase-on in different ways. This leads us to the next boss we'll be talking about, the sentient rock monster known as Thardus. And you heard me correctly, this monster is literally a combination of sentient rocks. Rocks made sentient through the phase-on radiation of inanimate objects, in this case rocks which became known as phase-on ore. This project was known as Project Titan. It's unclear as to whether or not space pirates specifically wanted to create weapons from inanimate objects through Project Titan, but given their track record of wanting to make weapons out of pretty much everything and some scans from the pirate base in Fendrana, it's heavily implied that this was in fact the case. However, even though they were successful in creating a living monster that could control and weaponize the elements in powerful ways out of otherwise non-living material through the use of phase-on radiation, they were not successful in maintaining any bit of control over their newly created rock guy, who apparently just kept getting more and more violent. So naturally, the space pirates quarantined the poor stone dude in a cave and just kind of left him there, abandoning Project Titan. He drops the Spider Ball upgrade for the Morph Ball when defeated. But even though Project Titan was abandoned, that doesn't mean the space pirates didn't have other projects cooking behind the scenes, which leads us to the next project and subsequently the next set of bosses, starting with the Elite Pirates, born from the marginally more successful Project Helix. Project Helix instead focused on infusing phase-on not only into living organisms, but into space pirate DNA directly. In fact, they actually decided to infuse space pirate embryos with the substance. But similarly to Project Titan's drawbacks, their experiments with growing phase-on space pirates led to the few surviving subjects experiencing a severe mental degradation that they termed phase-on madness, resulting in extreme bouts of aggression, killing any life form unfortunate enough to come into contact with them, kind of like rabies. Eventually, however, the space pirate research team named Team Sclera discovered a breakthrough strain of phase-on codenamed Vertigo Phase-on through their experiments with parasites. You know, that parasite queen business. This new Vertigo Phase-on was then used to create the much more sane elite pirates, which were successfully matured and trained for combat. Now, as if that wasn't already bad enough, Project Helix went on to successfully fuse a space pirate embryo directly with energized phase-on instead of Vertigo Phase-on. The result was the much more powerful Phase-on Elite, which attacks Samus with a different set of abilities, but ultimately serves the same purpose as far as the lore of the franchise is concerned. The final unholy creation of Project Helix would be one elite in particular known as the Elite Pirate Upsilon, or the Omega Pirate. This individual was also fused directly with energized phase-on, just like the Phase-on Elite. But his abnormally high tolerance for absorbing phase-on led the researchers of Team Sclera to essentially juice him with the stuff beyond all safety measures. The Omega Pirate, therefore, is significantly more powerful than any other elite pirate and possesses even more elite powers such as the ability to regenerate and cloak. He also laughs in battle, which is kind of creepy. Upon defeating the large dude, he dies, falls flat on top of Samus, dissolves into pure phase-on, cooks, and infuses into Samus's power suit, creating the extremely powerful phase-on suit, which enables Samus to absorb phase-on as energy and prevents phase-on radiation damage entirely. Now, with both phase-on projects aside, the space pirates were responsible for one more boss in the game, although it is a very quick and very easy to explain one, and admittedly kind of forgettable. The cloaked drone is just that. A flying sentry drone created by space pirates with the ability to cloak itself from the naked eye. More importantly, the room in which it is located is within the space pirate created phase-on mines and is called the Central Dynamo. Now, a dynamo is just another word for an electrical generator, and if Samus scans a computer screen within the dynamo, we can read that the dynamo itself is powering the phase-on processing and security systems. Interestingly, another computer screen tells us that due to bouts of phase-on madness in its workers, the dynamo has been completely abandoned. So in my opinion, this is why the cloaked drone was created. It's simply a machine built to safeguard the source of power in the phase-on mines instead of living space pirate workers and alert nearby elite pirates of any intruders. With the bosses created by space pirates all explained away, let's now focus solely on the most infamous, recurring, flying, dinosaur-like space pirate in the entire series. Ridley. Or in this case, Meta Ridley. You have to specify, you know, I mean, the guy has several different forms across nearly every Metroid game. Now I want to state quickly that because his appearance in this game is specifically as the cyborg known as Meta Ridley and not as his normal Ridley self from the first Metroid game, and in order to avoid going over the same material multiple times across different videos, I will be ranking his full explanation, deep diving into his origins, placement within the Space Pirate ranking, and status as the arch enemy of Samus herself for my Metroid Zero Mission boss lore video, which was his first appearance canonically after all, so please stay tuned for that, and subscribe. This of course significantly cuts down the information necessary to understand his appearance as Meta Ridley in Metroid Prime. Following his death at the hands of Samus Aran in the first Metroid adventure on the planet Zebes, which is the planet where Samus grew up and apparently the planet where Ridley's from, although that's not really canonical information, his exploded remains were apparently discovered by fellow space pirates. And because he was such a good little murderous super soldier, they decided to not only resurrect the exploded space dragon, but also upgrade him using their famed space pirate technology, giving him visible metal plating for skin and many new offensive abilities. And wouldn't you know it, the location where Ridley gets reborn as a cyborg is none other than the space pirate frigate Orpheon. You know, the one that Samus landed on at the very beginning of the game and encountered and killed the Parasite Queen, which blew up the entire facility. Ridley, now effectively Meta Ridley, broke free of his medical restraints and escaped the frigate just before its destruction, right in front of Samus's eyes. Clearly, he made his way down to the planet below for unknown reasons, because the next time Samus encounters him is when he attempts to kill her upon Samus collecting all 12 Chozo artifacts and attempting to enter the impact crater. But more on that in a second. Unfortunately for the big lizard, he just can't seem to get a win against the girl in the power suit, and thus Samus defeats Meta Ridley. But just before she can deliver a final decisive blow against her foe, the Chozo statues along the tops of the artifact temple seemingly come to life and shoot at him, pushing him off the edge of the platform and into the impact crater below. But don't worry, he doesn't actually die here. No, Ridley keeps returning to life all the way until Metroid Fusion, and who knows, he may still come back to life in the next game. If the next game ever gets made, that is. Finally, it's time to talk about the last boss in the game and the entity that the entire Metroid Prime series is named after, the Metroid Prime itself. Now, you might think that with a name like Metroid Prime, that means it's the first Metroid, but no, this is actually not the case. The word Prime used here just means that of all the Metroids encountered in the franchise, this would be probably the most important. Or I guess another way to say that would be the most individually impactful. There is a lot to cover, both canonical and theoretical, regarding the Metroid Prime, so let's start first with what we know about it from the game. Remember when I was talking about all that jargon regarding Phazon and its origin planet Phase and the Leviathan meteorites being sent out of Phase in order to crash into and corrupt other planets with their Phazon cores across the galaxies? Well, the one that hit Tallon IV 50 years before the events of the game created the giant impact crater, within which rests the Metroid Prime. See, this is a little bit of a spoiler alert for the video covering Metroid Prime 3, since this information is taken from that game, but according to findings in said game, when a Leviathan from Phase crashes into a planet, its source of Phazon, the Phazon core, begins to seep into the planet. And as it does so, the sentient Phazon core begins to attract the biggest and baddest local predator it can call out to. This predator, whatever species it might be, is drawn to the Phazon core and corrupted by it and reprogrammed into being a powerful defender of the Phazon core. In the case of Tallon IV and its Leviathan, the predator that was attracted to this core was none other than a Metroid, which is really unfortunate for the rest of the living beings across the galaxy. As a reminder, pure Metroids are practically invincible, predatory, life-sucking organisms created by the Chozo, with the initial purpose of feeding on and culling the much more deadly and also invincible parasite known as X. But I'll be explaining that in the Metroid Fusion video. They also feed on humans. Ow. For now, just know that Metroids are really deadly, and thanks to the space pirates finding them and, you know, trying to make weapons out of them like they do, one thing led to another, and they ended up taking Metroids with them off of their home planet of SR388 and across the galaxy, to other planets such as Zebes, or in this case, Tallon IV. Space pirates doing research things on Metroids on Tallon IV led to some escaping and adapting to the new planet and becoming known as Tallon Metroids, one of which was drawn to the Phazon core after the Leviathan's impact impact and thus began feasting on and absorbing the unlimited energy of the pure Phazon core, causing a mutation unlike any other Metroid in existence as it fused directly with the Phazon core itself, both entities becoming one, becoming the source of all Phazon on the planet and turning into the extremely dangerous Metroid Prime. Now, before I talk about what happens with the Metroid Prime after its encounter with everyone's favorite blonde bounty hunter, I'm going to pause and rewind a little bit. The more astute Metroid lore fans out there watching probably know where I'm going with this already, but basically the fact that a Chozo created Metroid that was transported by space pirates found its way to the Phazon core on Tallon IV is in and of itself an enigma that has never explicitly been explained to this day. But luckily or unluckily for you, I happen to love theories. So here's what makes sense to me. See, once the Leviathan impacted Tallon IV, it didn't take long for Phazon to spread through the planet and thus for the Chozo to be alerted by this. In fact, an ancient Chozo prophecy actually foretold the coming of something they called the Worm, which was said to be born from parasites, nurtured in a poisoned womb, devouring the world from within, which should sound familiar. And even though they didn't know it would be a Metroid that would become the foretold worm, they did accurately figure out that the Leviathan and its Phazon core are this poisoned womb that their prophecies warned them of, and because of this, and also because they were able to see the corrupting effects of Phazon before their very eyes, they decided to seal away the impact crater by building the artifact temple on top of it, otherwise known as the Cradle, in hopes to lock the Phazon away, by encasing the entire impact crater in a non-permissible energy shield. Of course, we know that all this really served to accomplish is to slow the spread of Phazon down just a bit, since its presence still led to massive energy readings being scanned from the planet, which attracted the space pirates and led to their many Phazon mining operations. The energy shield over the impact crater was successful in barring the space pirates from entry though, which is a good thing since they would have released the Metroid Prime slumbering inside. And speaking of the Metroid Prime, I'm sure you're wondering what all this explaining has to do with it. Well, it just so happens that Metroids were not present on Tallon IV before being brought there by space pirates, like I mentioned earlier, and the space pirates didn't arrive until they read the energy readings of Phazon from the planet, which meant that the Phazon core was already on the planet before they arrived, which means that the Cradle was probably already created by the time they landed. A Metroid escaping captivity from the space pirates and venturing off into the wilds of Tallon IV is believable enough, but the real question is how did this Metroid venture into the impact crater and reach the Phazon core if it was already completely sealed off by the Cradle's energy shield? Well, allow me to once again reach into the lore of Metroid Prime 3 to theoretically answer this question. In Prime 3, Samus encounters a new evolution of Metroids known as Phazon Metroids, which is exactly that, Metroids infused with Phazon. And remember how I mentioned that Phazon life forms such as the Leviathans are able to jump through wormholes in space? Well, Phazon Metroids just so happen to inherit this ability, and they're able to phase through local time-space. It's not difficult to believe at all in that case that a Tallon Metroid brought by space pirates to Tallon IV was either infused purposefully with Phazon or exposed itself to Phazon after escaping the pirates. They do have several laboratories and settlements deep inside the Phazon caves after all, and they already documented how some Metroids escaped captivity. And once this Metroid had evolved either by accident or by design into a Phazon Metroid, I think the Leviathan began to draw the Metroid into its core, leading to the unholy fusion of pure Phazon and Metroid, the creation of the Metroid Prime. But this is just a theory since it hasn't been proven in-game. Another possibility is that somehow Metroids also originated from Phase itself, and therefore one of them was already inside the Tallon IV's Leviathan. But that's also not a clean theory for several other reasons, but anyway, theories aside, once Samus encounters the beast by unlocking the Cradle's energy shield, which was by the Chozo's design since they also foretold the coming of the Entrusted One, aka Samus, she's able to defeat it by destroying its body with all sorts of beam fire and then attacking its core directly with pure blasts of Phazon until it is, again, defeated and begins to completely destabilize. But very importantly, just before it dissipates and dies for good, in one last attempt to live, it decides to grab a hold of Samus herself and attempt to pull her inside, presumably so it can feed off of her life force and prevent itself from dying by using her as a new body. She's able to escape, but only because the Metroid Prime literally sucks the Phazon out of her suit and absorbs it entirely. After Samus leaves, it's revealed that this is all that was necessary to create a new body for the Metroid Prime, one crafted out of the Phazon-infused DNA of Samus Aran, and thus the Metroid Prime undergoes one final evolution into Dark Samus herself. Along with inheriting a power suit, Dark Samus also inherits Samus's human intelligence, becoming much deadlier than the Metroid Prime could ever have hoped to be. But that is where this list comes to an end. Because in case you didn't know, Metroid Prime is a trilogy. Well, technically there's a fourth game, but we'll get to that later. So make sure you're subscribed to stick around for the boss lore of Metroid Prime 2, when Dark Samus's journey will continue. And please consider leaving a like if you enjoyed this video, or at least my efforts into making it. Huge thanks to everyone for watching, and to my Bandit crew for sticking with me through the dry months and continuing to support the channel. Seriously, without your support, Bandit games would be a thing of the past. And thank you to anyone who decides to support after watching my videos. Let me know in the comments below if there was anything I missed, or if you have a different theory for the Metroid Prime. And let me know what other franchises you'd like to see explored on the channel as well. That's all I've got for this one, so follow me on my socials and I'll see you next time. This is Bandit, signing out. Peace!